sharply analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And here on the Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission is to provide more light and less heat in our unwavering quest to uncover the truth. Stay with us as we shine a light where others won't. Well, today we're going to be looking at last weekend's so-called Summit on Peace in Ukraine. It was held at the Bergenstock Resort above Lake Lucerne, beautiful place in Switzerland. They had representatives from around 92 nations and 8 international organizations. They all attended the summit. Somebody who was not there, however, was Russia. They weren't even invited to the event. And President Vladimir Putin, he argues that the summit is simply an attempt by the West to create the illusion of a global anti-Russian coalition and distract attention from the root causes of the conflict. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who is currently Deputy Chairman of Russia's Security Council, he said it was an erratic and dysfunctional event whose participants did not have a clue what they were doing there. He even compared it to the summit, basically to George Orwell's Animal Farm, basically saying that how ideals of equality and freedom can be distorted and betrayed after a ruthless leader takes over. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Well, we're going to discuss all of that today with my brilliant panel, but I'd also like to hear from you. This is how you can get in touch.
Our lines are open. From the U.S. and Canada, call 1-888-201-6425. From the U.K., call 033-0024-1026. And from Australia and New Zealand, call 1-800-670-310. Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
And as always, if you've got any thoughts on the subjects we're going to be discussing today, or indeed if you want to discuss something completely different, do get in touch. It's always good to hear from you, and we've had some brilliant contributions. Now, today, the Muckrakers made up of me, Andrew Eborn, but also the return of Professor Glenn Diesen and Dr. John Laughland. Welcome to you both. Just a reminder, this is a forum for debate and conversation, so feel free to speak and share your thoughts as you see fit. Don't need to wait for me to prompt you. Bit of background, Professor Glenn Diesen is a Norwegian academic and political scientist. He's professor at the University of South Eastern Norway and an associate editor at the Russia in Global Affairs journal. Professor Diesen's main research focuses Russian foreign policy, geoeconomics conservatism, and Eurasian integration. And my other guest today, Dr. John Laughland, is director of Forum for Democracy International and a lecturer in political science and history at the Catholic Institute of the Vendée in Western France. He was director of the Eurosceptic think tank European Foundation until 2008 and director of studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris until 2018. He worked at the European Parliament from 2018 to 2020. Itself. Right, the front lines in Ukraine have barely moved since the end of 2022, despite tens of thousands of dead on both sides in relentless trench warfare, the bloodiest fighting in Europe since World War II. The so-called Peace Summit planned basically calls for Russia to withdraw from all territories claimed by Kyiv. Isn't there zero chance of Russia agreeing to this? Let's start with you, Glenn.
Well, no, I don't think so because, Russia has considered this to be an existential threat. They see the incursion of NATO into Ukraine, worst case obviously being NATO taking over the Crimea, where Russia's Black Sea Fleet would be. This would be an existential threat they couldn't live with. But that being said, the actual summit now, it didn't go into that much specifics because a lot of the key points were quite, not that specific exactly for the key reason that they needed to go for the quantity. They needed a lot of participants. So if you read through the agreements they had, they listed, for example, 3 crucial points. One was, nuclear installations had to be kept safe. Global food security, so transitioning through the Black Sea was important. And the third was, prisoners of war and civilians detained, including Ukrainian children in Russia, all have to be exchanged. Now, this all of this was largely unproblematic, and they could have invited Russia for this. But again, they had a dilemma. Do you want to get many participants, or do you want to actually push some key points? So they didn't really put that strong demands on anyone, so they could build up the proper quantity. And this is also why the whole thing appeared to be a bit of a PR stunt, to be honest, to be able to simply build up a narrative that the world is mobilized against, or at least world opinion is mobilized against Russia. So, but if you look at the content, what they actually signed under, it's it's not very specific, which is why the media, I think, largely avoided this part.
Yeah, John?
I think that's exactly right. It's what they call a nothing burger, isn't it? It's a mountain that has given birth to a mouse, as they say in French. These 3 points, the ones that Glenn Diesen has just mentioned, that's right. It's true, of course, that the communique also talks about the territorial integrity of Ukraine. That's par for the course. But your question, Andrew, was, would Russia ever agree to liberating or returning the provinces of Ukraine that it currently occupies? And the answer is absolutely not. Again, as Glenn has said, Crimea is definitely never going to be given back. The other 4 regions have, of course, been annexed, as we know, by Russia, and Russia has been very vehement in saying that it will that it regards them now as part of its territory, and that it will use all means necessary to defend its territory. That means including nuclear weapons. And as you hinted, Andrew, but perhaps didn't say explicitly, just before the conference, the Russian President Vladimir Putin said, well, yes, we can have peace if Ukraine gives up what it holds of the 4 regions, because of the 4 regions, only one of them is completely under Russian control. And obviously, Ukraine is not prepared to do that either. So, yes, we are further from peace than we have ever been. Each step that NATO takes, including this summit, is further escalation. And although the summit communique repeatedly refers to the United Nations Charter, which the Western leaders have been trumpeting as proof that the world is on their side, because, of course, the Charter includes territorial integrity, the fact is that the United Nations Charter contains lots of things. And one of the main things it contains, if not the main thing, is that people should resolve their conflicts by peaceful means. And yet that's precisely not what NATO and Ukraine are doing. NATO and Ukraine and the European Union and the collective West have repeatedly ruled out peace. They've repeatedly ruled it out. In fact, they ruled it out in September 2022 with a Ukrainian law saying that they were not going to negotiate with Russia, therefore not have any kind of peace discussions. So it's a complete misnomer. That's why Medvedev called it Orwellian. And instead, we see, as I say, escalation, the authorization, obviously, by the United States and other countries for NATO weapons to strike targets inside Russia. The treaties, the 10-year treaty that the United States signed at the G7 summit in Italy, which follows 5 treaties signed by European countries. These are ways of prolonging the military support and financial support for Ukraine. So I listened yesterday, I think it was, to the Serbian president, Alexander Vučić, in a, I thought, rather moving interview, I believe with a Swiss newspaper. He was speaking in English, in which he says we are 3 or 4 months away at most from a global conflagration, including possibly with nuclear weapons. And I think that analysis is realistic.
Yeah. What do you say to that, Glenn? Is that realistic, that analysis?
No, I agree, both on the Russian peace proposal, but also the direction we're going. Just in terms of what Russia offered right before this so-called peace summit was, it was based on effectively return to the Istanbul treaty, that is the peace agreement which the Ukrainians and Russians were negotiating at the beginning of 2022 before the US and the UK sabotaged it. But this was largely based around the concept of restoring Ukraine's neutrality, so no NATO expansion. But of course, there's been 2 years of war fighting, and in these 2 years, we see that Russia annexed these 4 territories: Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. And they've made it very clear that they're not going to give up these territories. Now, I might be wrong, but I suspect that it's possible that this is also an opening proposal, that perhaps there is room for negotiation in terms of where the administrative borders of this would go. So, for example, Zaporozhye and Kherson, they have territory on the western side of the Dnieper River. Now, maybe the Russians will be open to negotiating over some of where the administrative borders would actually go. But beyond this, they're not going to cede any of this territory simply because they don't trust NATO anymore. They had the Minsk agreement for 7 years, which didn't go anywhere. Before that, the Europeans, they negotiated with the Ukrainian government, effectively an agreement when they were destabilizing the Ukrainian government, that they would guarantee a unity government. They abandoned that as well. So time after time, the Russians feel that they've been betrayed. So they're not going to cede some territory and then see effectively the war coming back again. So they will hold on to this, I think, simply because it's seen as a guarantee that these regions will not fall into the hands of NATO in the future. In terms of where this war is going, I unfortunately agree with the Serbian Prime Minister, because we see this gradual escalation, and we're keeping reassured in the media that this is not really an escalation. We're not doing anything dangerous, but we've seen over the past two years. First Biden said he wouldn't send tanks, they wouldn't send F-16s, they wouldn't have artillery system, no long-range missiles, and now, of course, all of this is being given, and also green lighting, striking inside Russian territory. We have this incremental escalation in which effectively waiting until they get a proper retaliation from Russia and seeing how far we can take this. Now, the problem is Russia's being presented with a dilemma. They can either strike back at NATO and then risk a world war, or they can simply allow NATO to cross every red line. But where will it stop? Will we allow the American jets to start bombing Moscow? This is the problem. So there's more growing pressure now on the Russian president that they have to start to retaliate against the West. And this is why you see nuclear weapons drill. This is why you see warships coming into Cuba. And this is why they're threatening to send weapons to enemies of the West so they can strike possibly the West through third parties, which the West is doing through the Ukrainians. So there's you're reaching the point now where I think an actual war with Russia is possible.
Yeah, and it's a worrying moment, isn't it, indeed? We're going to take a quick break, but we will be back to discuss it further.
TNT's Alex Zaharov-Reutt.
Now, thankfully, we're all stars in this reality show on a universal scale, but 2 of the biggest stars next week will be Apple and then Elon Musk. And Elon Musk will see Tesla shareholders vote on Musk's $45 billion pay package, which a judge in Delaware interfered with earlier this year. Elon will be a multi-billionaire either way, but it is disturbing to see the US justice system interfering with Elon Musk and Donald Trump. Who will they interfere with next?
Talking Tech with Alex Zaharov-Reutt on today's News Talk, TNT.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702. Or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, my very special guest, Professor Glenn Diesen and Dr. John Laughland. And we're looking at the Peace Summit, so-called Peace Summit, which took place in Switzerland. Why do you, I mean, it was interesting they chose Switzerland because obviously it's officially been a military neutral country since 1815. What's your view on the location, John?
Well, yes. I mean, Switzerland has a long tradition of neutrality, a tradition which it has itself very greatly undermined in recent years and decades. Switzerland takes part, for example, in NATO operations, for instance, in Kosovo. Switzerland has joined economic sanctions, which normally it wouldn't do or shouldn't do if it was a neutral country. But Switzerland is also the original home of the United Nations, of the League of Nations after the First World War, and then part of the United Nations is still there, of course, in Geneva. So I think that's why they chose Switzerland. It's worth recalling as well that when Joe Biden was elected, he met Vladimir Putin in Geneva, also with a nod to, Switzerland's role in preserving peace. I very much agree with what Glenn said just before the break. I would like to add two things. First of all, we were talking about escalation and retaliation and the possibility of a major conflict. In the West, in my view, there is a surfeit of moral condemnation. The West likes nothing more than to say this is an illegal war, it was a war of aggression, it's unprovoked, and so on. And I think this moral condemnation blinds Western leaders to what, in fact, they should be doing. Because you can condemn morally as much as you like, but if the other side is stronger than you and forces you to do something you don't want to do, then your moral condemnation really isn't worth anything. And I say that in the context of the fact that Russia, in this, what is now a 10-year history of conflict in Ukraine, because it didn't start in 2022, as we all know, it started in 2014 with the Maidan coup and the annexation of Crimea. Russia has systematically said what it will do if certain things are done, and then those things having been done, has done them. So it said in 2014, Crimea is a red line, and it annexed Crimea as a result of the revolution in Kiev. In 2021-22, it said, if you don't give us security guarantees and stop attacking the Donbas republics, we will invade. They didn't give security guarantees. They didn't stop attacking the Donbas republics, and Russia invaded. And now Russia is saying, if you launch, for example, attacks with F-16s against our territory from bases in NATO countries like Romania, for example, then there is no reason why we would not attack the airfields from where those planes are taking off. So on the basis of the last 10 years, we should have no doubt, or very little doubt, that Russia might actually, as she has in the previous occasions, been true to her word. And that's even leaving aside the apocalypse scenario of nuclear war. That is obviously an extremely, very, very dangerous outcome. And of course, Glenn has already referred, as I said, to the possibility of third countries, the Houthis, for example, or Cuba or whatever, also being used. The other point I wanted to make is that in spite of the Swiss location, and in spite of Switzerland's reputation as a humanitarian center and all the rest of it, the summit was remarkable also for the people who didn't come, or the countries that didn't sign up. China is the most obvious example. Russia, as we know, wasn't even invited, but China was invited and didn't go. And a number of countries, and including very big ones, either didn't go or didn't sign up to the communique. They include Brazil, India, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia, for God's sake. Saudi Arabia, which for decades, ever since the Second World War, ever since 1945, has been a solid Western ally, is pivoting, as it has done on other things like BRICS and selling oil in different currencies and so on, has pivoted away from the West. And obviously, when you've got Brazil and India and South Africa, these are not negligible entities on the international stage. So if you get I don't know, North Macedonia or Estonia or these tiny countries, these microstates to sign up because, as Glenn said, they wanted to have as many countries as possible. That's ultimately irrelevant in terms of the world balance of power. But once you get huge continental or subcontinental sized countries like China, India, Brazil not signing up or not even going, then I think the lesson is that the Western predominance or hegemony is basically unraveling. So that's what I take away from the Swiss event.
Yeah, and as you point out, Brazil's only attended as an observer, and India, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa all withheld their signatures, didn't they, from the summit communique? What's your take on it, Glenn?
No, also other countries which have been more friendly towards the West, so from Thailand to Colombia, they were also reluctant. But it's in terms of what John mentioned with this, they wanted to make as big a list as possible with signatories, but because the BRICS country and many others didn't want to sign, and also, as mentioned, China didn't even want to show up, they had to add a few lists. So if you go to the Swiss government's website, where they have an outline of this declaration, they also have a list of countries who supported the joint communique, and those countries include the Council of Europe, European Commission, European Council, European Parliament. These are all EU institutions, they're not countries. So they really went through to great extent to add some meat on the bone and make it look as if there were more than actually wanted to join. Now, and this is part of the problem. I think it was, to a large extent, it's not a peace summit, but it was very deceptive. Because if you don't invite Russia and you don't even represent or talk about the Russian security interests, then what is the purpose? Is it to find out where we might have agreements, where the disagreements are, what may be bridged? No, of course not. The purpose is to mobilize public opinion. And, because the objective has been to defeat Russia on the battlefield, destroy its economy, and also isolate it in the international affairs. And this purpose is to isolate it in international affairs. It's to give the impression that the world has gone against Russia. You can only look at Rutte, the former Prime Minister of Netherlands, who's now likely to become, or still, but now likely to become the next Secretary General of NATO. He was very proud that 90 countries were represented, and he argued that this demonstrated that the international community was against Russia, and that he argued Putin was now panicking. So this is PR, it's narrative building, it's sloganeering. He also argued that Putin should have attended, but he wasn't invited. Also, they have an arrest warrant against him, so he can't even come. So it's very deceptive. Either he didn't know this or it's stupidity, but neither of this should be a good excuse. So my whole point is that the purpose here was not to find a peaceful solution. It's simply, yet again, try to defeat the opponent, mobilize opinion. And this is why I wouldn't even call it a peace summit. It's very deceptive in nature.
And from some of the attendees, we heard belligerent rhetoric of a kind that really makes you wonder about their sanity. I'm thinking of the Polish president, Andrzej Duda, who talked about Russia being an empire with 200 nationalities living on its territory that needed to decolonize. This is equivalent to saying that we are fighting this war in order to break Russia apart, which, of course, the Estonian is she Prime Minister or President Kallas has also said repeatedly that Russia needs to be broken up. And, Russia has repeatedly said that this war is existential for Russia. And when you have leading European leaders, I'm thinking more of the Polish president than the Estonian, saying that Russia needs to be broken up, how can you expect them to react in any other way? This is a NATO leader, a European Union leader, saying that one of the war aims is to decolonize Russia. This is the most extreme form of war rhetoric. So, as Glenn says, it's definitely not a peace conference. It's definitely trying to invent a narrative, but in fact, it was a war conference.
Yeah, and certainly the language is not of peace. And if you want to have peace with anybody, jaw, not war, you have to invite everybody to sit around the table. Why do you think Putin wasn't invited, Glenn?
Well, because it wasn't a peace summit. And again, this is what's been the problem all along, that we don't want to understand the security concern of the adversary. And this is why the political propaganda is so dangerous, because if you like Prime Minister Duda or the Prime Minister of Estonia, who's calling for breaking up Russia, is considered to be very patriotic. You're signaling that you're with us in our camp. But if you're calling for negotiations, peaceful settlement, restoring basic diplomacy, it's seen as being pro-Russian. It's treacherous. You're taking the side of the enemy, effectively. And it is no appreciation that you can't have security if you don't take into consideration the opponent. And I think this is part of the problem. We propagandize so heavily now for so long that it's starting to seem normal when you have the NATO Secretary General chanting that more weapons is the path to peace, and no one blinking an eyelash, even criticizing that we now have more than 2 years of no diplomacy, no negotiations, while the Ukraine nation is being destroyed, and you see we're taking these giant steps towards nuclear war. This is why it's so depressing, because what you're seeing here is not just a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. This is a huge crisis of European security, because for 25 years now, we based European security on the concept that we should redivide the continent and push these militarized dividing lines closer and closer to Russian borders, even though we knew they considered this to be an existential threat and would react on it. This was a recipe for security and stability. Now all of this is collapsing, and we're risking actual World War III. So there's a lot of stake, and we really need political giants with extraordinary political imagination to find a way to navigate ourselves out of this. But instead, we have this era of political midgets. It's all optics, narrative building, sloganeering, and there's nothing of substance. So there's no good answer to that question. Obviously, if you want a peace summit, you invite the other side. This makes perfect sense. But perfect sense is, it's long gone. We're not doing this anymore.
Yeah, and as you say, major defence companies are now recruiting workers at the fastest rate since the end of the Cold War. Also, NATO Secretary General, he's basically stated the alliance is in talks to deploy more nuclear weapons, taking them out of storage. It's just been reported, and he calls that a deterrent. What he actually said is transparency helps communicate the direct message that we, of course, are a nuclear alliance. NATO's aim is, of course, a world without nuclear weapons. But as long as nuclear weapons exist, we will remain a nuclear alliance, because a world where Russia, China, and North Korea have nuclear weapons and NATO does not is a more dangerous world. What's your take on that, John?
Well, it's interesting that you raised the issue of nuclear weapons, because I was going to say that I heard yesterday a report, which I hadn't heard previously, that we know, many people know that there was a peace agreement, or at least the beginning of a peace agreement, very soon after the war broke out, so in March 2022. And many people know that that agreement was scuppered under British and American pressure. But I didn't know, and maybe Glenn can confirm this, as I only heard it recently, that at one point, I believe actually before the war broke out, Russia and America got into discussions about whether or not ballistic nuclear weapons would be stationed on the territory of Ukraine, NATO weapons. According to what I heard, as I say, I haven't been able to verify it, Joe Biden apparently seemed to be open to negotiating on this point, but Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, refused and said, on the contrary, we'll do whatever the hell we like, and if we want to put nuclear weapons, ballistic nuclear weapons on the territory of Ukraine, we'll do so. Now, that I just mentioned that point so that everybody understands when Glenn and I and others talk about an existential threat to Russia. People talk about NATO and countries being free to join alliances, and Ukraine should be free to join alliances. Yes, in abstract, that's true. But if it means, as it does, or might do, that you would have military bases with nuclear weapons as close as they would then be to the Russian border, just as, by the way, in Finland, I believe 13, Glenn, is based in, you're based in Sweden. No, you're based in Norway, Glenn. But anyway, there are 13 now American bases in Finland that have opened as soon as Finland joined NATO. So concretely, that's what this NATO enlargement means. It means the moving forward of American bases, possibly, of course, with nuclear weapons, to within, in some cases, less than 100 kilometers of the Russian border. And that's why Russia has launched this war, to preemptively prevent that.
Glenn?
Yeah, and I would just like to add that this is some of the problem when NATO says it's going to start posturing more with its nuclear weapons in order to deter Russia. What exactly does deterrence mean? Because in the past, when we said deterrence, it meant so Russia won't strike the West with nuclear weapons, then we want to do the same, then we'll do the same in kind. But now we're trying to deter Russia from effectively retaliating. So we're using NATO weapons with NATO targeting, striking inside Russia, even with cluster ammunition striking Russian cities, civilian targets. And we're going to now deter Russia from retaliating against NATO if it will, for example, strike an airfield or a logistics center. So it's all framed in the language of defense, but at the same time we're moving forward. And John mentioned all these bases now also appearing in Scandinavia, so Sweden, Finland, and also Norway, because the Americans they have their eyes set on the Arctic as well. But there's three seas through its history. The UK and the UK and the US has always tried to block three seas of Russia. The one is in the Arctic, which is why Scandinavia is being militarized. It's the Baltic Sea, and the former NATO Secretary General said that we can put a blockade on St. Petersburg and the Baltic Sea now that Sweden and Finland have joined. And of course, it's the Black Sea, which is the purpose of getting Ukraine into NATO. And just one last thing about moving the military infrastructure to east. It was recognized 2 months ago in the New York Times that after the government in Ukraine was toppled in 2014 with the support of the West, the first thing the new intelligence officer did, the intelligence chief of the new Ukrainian government, which the Americans helped to handpick, was to establish a partnership with the CIA and MI6, which included 12 CIA bases along the Russian borders. So we can use all this language of just wanting defense and just protecting and helping Ukraine. But the US is not Amnesty International with nuclear weapons. They do have interest. They have security interest, which they have defined as hegemony, and this is how you pursue it.
John, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what the war is about. And again, I would invite our listeners to listen to President Vučić of Serbia, who said, the two sides are so far apart because we've talked, Glenn and I, with you, Andrew, we've talked about the existential threat to Russia, but yes. It is also an existential threat, this war, from the point of view of the West. I don't agree that it's an existential West, but in the minds of Western leaders, what they need to preserve is what Glenn just said, is their hegemony. They planned for hegemony at the end of the Cold War. It's well-known history, 1992 onwards. They went for it with NATO's wars in Yugoslavia and in Libya. The Americans particularly, of course, went for full spectrum dominance. We know all that. That's all well understood. And of course, they continue to behave. You only have to read the G7 communique to realize this. It's unbelievable, the G7 communique. It's like listening to a lecture from a grumpy schoolmaster. You're the naughty boy at the back of the class and you're being told what to do, because line after line is Iran shouldn't do this and China shouldn't do that, and firing off instructions in all directions. That's the world that the Western leaders want to preserve, this world of, I think, partly imagined hegemony. I mean, partly imagined, let's say not entirely imagined hegemony. And yes, if, as I believe, NATO and Ukraine do not prevail, I don't believe that they can prevail. We haven't even, by the way, got onto the military side. We've been talking about the diplomatic side, but I think there are many, many arguments for saying that militarily, of course, if there's a nuclear war, we'll all be dead. But until that final conflagration, the last 2 years have shown that Russia is winning militarily, or to put it more precisely, NATO is losing militarily. And it's doing so, by the way, for a range of reasons. There's a whole range there's literally not a single indicator, militarily speaking, which is in NATO's favor at the moment. Russia has hypersonic missiles, which NATO doesn't have. Russia produces more than twice as many shells as United States and Europe combined. Russia produces 3 or 4 million shells a year, Europe and America 1.2 million. Russia has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men. NATO has joke armies. NATO, when France started to talk about sending troops, Britain and France can probably send 10,000 men each. The Russians have got 300,000 reservists mobilized. They have 150,000. They've had 150,000 men in Ukraine since 2022. NATO and Ukraine are not capable of prevailing militarily, and if they don't prevail, as I believe they won't, then the apparently existential Western hegemony will be over.
Okay, we're going to have to take another break now, but we will be back after these important messages to continue the discussion with Professor Glenn Diesen and Dr. John Laughland. Do not go anywhere.
I was a quarterback at Hardaway High School, college first-round draft pick, on and off the field. We were taught to not show any signs of weakness. During the football season, I would stop eating, but I didn't know I was depressed. I thought that something was wrong with me. For 20 plus years was physical. We didn't have any education behind what mental health was. I started to learn it starts here first. If this is together, I'll be better as a father, as a man, and as a husband. Put the importance on your mental health. I'm not scared to talk about it anymore. The first tool is therapy. The second one is positive self-talk. And then journaling, putting your thoughts on paper. We have to redefine what being a strong man is and heal, love your mind.
Need a ride? Yeah!
Driving with kids is a big responsibility.
Hop in and buckle up!
So don't sweat the small stuff.
You got paint all over our paper!
Get the big stuff right instead.
What does that mean?
Like making sure your kids are in the correct car seat and buckled up for safer travel.
That deserves a wiggly wiggly wig.
To make sure your child is in the right seat for their age and size, visit nhtsa.gov/the right seat.
The Muckrakers are restless. This is today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, and my very special guest, Professor Glenn Diesen and Dr. John Laughland. We've been hearing their opinions on this so-called peace summit, which we've sort of worked out is probably not a peace summit if you don't invite all parties there. Very keen to hear from you. Here is how you can get in touch.
Our lines are open. From the U.S. and Canada, call 1-888-201-6425. From the U.K., call 033-0024-1026. And from Australia and New Zealand, call 1-800-670-310. Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Now, the background to the conference is interesting, given the recent European Parliament elections and some shock results, so let's put it that way, to the pro-war EU establishment. Do you think, Glenn, that those election results have made a difference to those in power?
Well, yes and no. I don't think it matters that much to the European Union. It can still push forward, but it's a strong indication that things are not going well in Europe. And part of the problem is obviously that a lot of these leaders, they're not acting on national interest. They're not really delivering. And I think this was quite obvious. Scholz, of course, is not doing well. Macron, his party got less than half of what Le Pen's did. So you see that it's not going well across the continent. Now, obviously, in EU elections, because they're seen as perhaps not mattering that much, it's an easier forum to express the dissent. So it's not that much to lose. So maybe in national elections, there's more interest perhaps to go with the devil you know, rather than experimenting too much with a protest vote. but still, it's showing that there's a huge dissent on the continent. Many of these reasons, there's many reasons for this, of course, but obviously the war in Ukraine is also one that people are now beginning to become more worried about war. But as the foreign minister of Germany once said, I don't care what my voters say, I will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. So I guess this is the sentiment which is worrying more and more of the public. So it's also quite interesting that the parties which have done well, from AfD in Germany to the French opposition, is that they're all very critical of the war, but also NATO's role in this war. So for me, it was quite indicative because, John mentioned earlier how the world was shifting now from hegemony to multipolarity, and how this is creating panic in the West, which is why they're perhaps acting so recklessly. And in terms of the G7 meeting that was just now, we see the people the world leaders, the Biden, Scholz, Macron, Kishida, Sunak, Trudeau, they're all collapsing in the polls. They're all lame ducks, making huge statements. So I think things are not going well at all. And I think it's quite predictable that a lot of these leaders will eventually be pushed out. So there could come huge changes from within the Western countries as well.
I think you're absolutely right on that. It does seem to be extraordinary that the politicians are deaf to what the electorate actually want. What's your take on it, John?
Well, I'm a little less optimistic, I think, than Glenn. It's true, of course, that Macron is weakened, Scholz is weakened. Glenn, you mentioned a moment ago Mark Rutte. Mark Rutte lost an election in November 2023, and there he is still as Dutch Prime Minister because the process of replacing him and forming a new government has taken so long. So yes, I agree with you on that. On the other hand, I think that the results themselves, the results of the European elections themselves, which was your question, Andrew, are, from the pro-peace point of view, pretty disappointing. The fact is that the centrist majority is intact, which is to say the pro-war majority. The dissident parties, they did okay in France and Germany. But on this specific question of the war and of relations with Russia, they have adopted the NATO and EU position. So there's no contestation from those parties. The AfD in Germany does have people who want peace and want a good relationship with Russia, but even they are. I'm not sure if they're a minority in their own party, but they also have people who are on the other side of the argument and so on. So there isn't really any, and above all, I would say that I don't think Europeans are aware of the dangers. I've been asked. I've done interview. I did an interview on Friday for Russian television, and they said, "But and how important was the Ukraine war in these elections?" And I said, "Don't be ridiculous. Nobody talked about it. You in Russia, you're thinking about it because you're very close to it, but most people in Europe aren't." They did a poll in the Netherlands on election night to ask people what issues they thought were important, and they came up with a lot of absolute nonsense, like healthcare and security. And I mean, when I say security, I don't mean military security. I mean, law and order, things which in any case have nothing to do with the European Union. So people, I'm afraid, didn't vote on the Ukraine war. They don't think about the Ukraine war. They don't think that there's a danger. And the dissident parties, in as much as they exist in Western Europe, they have basically rallied to the pro-NATO position. And the dissident countries, which are Hungary and Slovakia since a month or two, Brussels is turning the screws on them as well. Brussels announced a €1 million a day fine against Hungary for its migration policy. So they are continuing. The dogs bark and the caravan moves on. So I'm afraid I don't really draw any hope from the European Parliament elections, in addition to which, of course, as Glenn has already said, it doesn't matter what the European Parliament does, because the European Parliament, in spite of its endless resolutions about foreign policy, doesn't conduct the foreign policy of the European Union. The European Union's foreign policy, to the extent that it exists, is conducted by the member states and increasingly now by the Commission. And the Commission obviously is elected.
Lots of people are getting in touch and making some brilliant points. We've got Chris in the chat is saying NATO and the USA wanted this war. The West was never going to honour the Minsk agreements. The agenda was to go to war with Russia under any pretext. Is he right, Glenn?
Yeah, I think the Ukrainians were set up as a proxy. So, I'm not sure what else to add there. I think this was quite clear from the beginning. Again, there's been a lot of revelation as well. Keep in mind that when the US and the UK sabotaged this peace agreement in the beginning of 2022. And by the way, since 2014, the Americans were quite open about their displeasure with the Minsk agreement. John McCain called it Moscow BS. And in 2022, when they sabotaged the agreement which the Ukrainians and Russians were reaching, there's a lot of evidence coming out there. For example, the main mediators, both the Israeli and the Turkish, they confirmed that they reached a consensus on everything based on restoring neutrality. But this is the main importance for Washington because it wants a proxy, not neutrality. So the Israelis and Turks, they argued that they pressured Zelensky to instead choose war by saying we're not going to support a peace, but we're going to give you weapons. And according to them, they said that the British and Americans saw an opportunity to effectively start killing Russians. So they can use the Ukrainians as a third party to weaken a strategic adversary. You even have scholars like Neil Ferguson. He was doing interviews with British and American leaders in March of 2022, in which they were very open that we're not going to accept any peace here. The only acceptable outcome is to bleed Russia weak and then have regime change in Moscow. So they've been quite open about this all along. It's been confirmed by Zelensky's former advisor Arestovich, the head of Zelensky's own political party, and a Ukrainian ambassador which participated in the negotiations. They all said the same thing. Yeah, we were close to an agreement. The Russians were willing to do almost everything and compromise on everything except for neutrality. And as we also learned, as the former advisor of Zelensky said, the Americans saw an opportunity. They could make the Russians and the Ukrainians kill each other as two monkeys with knives, he said. So this was effectively the direction they're going. And even the former head of the German Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, Harald Kuyat, he was also former head of NATO's military committee. He also said they had an agreement, but then the Americans and British came along to sabotage it, so they would have a proxy to fight and kill Russians and effectively weaken Russia, knock it out of the game of great powers, and then they could focus all their energy on the Chinese. I mean, multiple American leaders, military leaders, political leaders, they all say this quite openly, but our media doesn't report on it. So it sounds as if it's a conspiracy theory. But this is, what Lindsey Graham, you have Mitch McConnell, you have General Keith Kellogg, you have an abundance of these leaders all saying always the same thing. And this is, we have a chance now to knock out the Russians without losing any of our own troops. And then we can split up the Russians and Chinese and go after the latter. So I think the evidence is already there.
John, do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I would just add to all those very important references that Glenn has given, the very well-known statements by former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and former French President François Hollande, that the Minsk agreements, they've made these admissions independently of each other. One of them, Merkel to a German newspaper, François Hollande to those two Russian pranksters who ring people up and make them think that they're talking to someone else. I think François Hollande thought he was talking to Poroshenko, if I remember correctly. But anyway, both of them said that the Minsk agreements were signed to enable Ukraine to gain time. Well, gain time for what? Well, we know the answer for what. We know the answer to the question for what, because in 2021, in other words, in the year that preceded the war or preceded the Russian invasion, the Americans signed a military agreement, two military agreements with Ukraine, one in August and one in November of 2021. The British signed one in, it was either June or July, a naval agreement. And those agreements they were quite explicitly, they're online, you can consult them, were designed to rearm Ukraine in order to enable it to retake Crimea. and no doubt also the Donbass. So that's the background. The Minsk agreements were signed in 2015 to give Ukraine time to reconquer what it regards as its territory, and that's with American, British, and European help. So yes, the listener is absolutely right to say that the West wants war. And as Glenn has said, these various American strategists, you didn't mention General Milley, Mark Milley, he said, this will be Russia's Afghanistan. In other words, we will draw the Russians in to a morass, into a war of attrition that they will lose. That's the NATO strategy. That is the strategy. It's not working, but that is the strategy.
Can I add one thing there? That is,
yes, please.
Yeah, John mentioned in November of 2021 when the Ukrainians and Americans had this agreement to intensify military cooperation for the purpose also of restoring control over Crimea, which was the main prize for the United States. At this point, you had the advisor of a former French President Sarkozy, and he went out in the media and he said that this security agreement in November of 2021 convinced the Russians that they must either attack or be attacked.
Yes.
So again, this is not my words. And also, when Putin and Biden were meeting in Switzerland to find some negotiation, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, who also, by the way, was responsible for peace negotiations over the Donbass, he wrote an article where it was titled that confrontation, success is confrontation, in which he argued the best outcome for these talks would be nothing, because anything would be appeasement, and it's better to have conflict. And just on the last point on the Afghanistan issue, this is what Hillary Clinton also said in March of 2022. She said everyone now in Washington has kind of the same agreed upon one format, and that's Afghanistan. So drag the Soviets drag Russia into an Afghanistan in Europe, and just drain it, or in Ukraine, and drain it of resources, military equipment, manpower. And so this makes sense from the American side. You weaken a strategic adversary, but for the Europeans, to allow our continent to be transformed into another Afghanistan, it seems treacherous, and yet this is what we associate now with the patriotism, and what we shouldn't be allowed to even criticize.
Yeah. I want to try and finish on a positive note, if there is such a thing. I mean, Swiss President Viola Amherd has told the media that there will be a potential second Global Peace Summit where Vladimir Putin may be permitted to attend. What do you think a post-war settlement might look like? 30 seconds each. Let's start with you, John.
Well, I'm sorry to be unable to be optimistic. I think that a peace settlement will come. Clausewitz said that war is the attempt to impose your law on the other person for fear that he imposes his law onto you. It's a test of strength. My feeling is that Russia will prevail. I can't say when, and that if I'm right, and if Russia does prevail, then Ukraine will be more or less forced to sign whatever the Russians are prepared to sign. But of course, there are many other outcomes, and it could be a frozen conflict. In other words, an ongoing conflict without an agreement for years or decades.
Glenn, 5 seconds to you.
Well, it has to be neutrality first, and what to do with the territories. It could be frozen, but Russia would be very worried. NATO would try to buy time, rearm, and restart the conflict. So they would need a guarantee.
Okay, yep. Glenn Diesen, Dr. John Laughland, thank you very much for joining us. I'll be back with you same time tomorrow here on the Muckrakers. Take care.